how submissions were received by the commission, and whether or not it made a difference whether they were a written submission or a submission in person, and whether or not it mattered whether the submissions were part of a concerted effort by a community or by a group, or whether individual submissions, how you weighed them and how you looked at them throughout the process.
All right, thanks for that. Well, the Commission tried as hard as it could to get as much citizen involvement as possible. The website had been advertised, and there was you could make a submission directly on the website to the Commission. We also, of course, asked anyone that wanted to sign up for an oral to give an oral report or at any of our meetings to do so. I must admit I was a little bit surprised and a little bit disappointed with how few written submissions there were. There were only 44 written submissions from the province, all through the province. There were, however, a large number of oral presentations from a wide variety of individuals and/or individuals representing groups. We took everyone seriously. One of the benefits of having the individuals in person giving an oral presentation is that we were able to ask the presenter questions and to try to push a little bit on this or that issue and get a little bit more detail. We received submissions from a variety of individuals who were representing particular groups. We also heard from a number of municipal councils, these sorts of things. We took those very seriously, and as I was trying to say in my presentation, there were a couple of times where we really learned a lot. I mean, one of our mandates was to take into consideration not just geographical factors, but human factors, communities of interest, transportation, communication links, and so on. So we learned a lot about how some of the communities interact, and we found that by splitting those communities, in our proposed boundaries, we were making a mistake, and we changed that. Now, one of the rather sort of embarrassing situations we did come across was that we tried very hard not to split rural municipalities, and we're actually very proud of the fact that very few RMs were split. We also split a few of the communities of interest, and then decided after we'd already sent out the proposed boundaries that we were probably going to change that, but that didn't leave us immune from criticism. So at one meeting, for instance, we had there was an individual who came, and she was extremely angry and accused the Commission of a crime equivalent to the expulsion of the Acadians because we had divided two French-Canadian communities in our proposed boundaries. Now, we couldn't actually say it, but we'd already pretty much decided that we were going to put those back together in the new riding of Dawson Trail. Another thing that was very interesting from the submissions was that a lot of people commented upon our names. And there was a feeling from a number of people, and the commissioners agreed with this, that if we could get away from hyphenated names, that would be very good. And if we could get away from names that seem to advantage one community within a riding, that would also be good. And so you'll notice that we've come up with more generic terms like Agassiz, Spruce Woods, Riding Mountain, Midland, Dawson Trail. So I think that was another good thing. And we also found that in a couple of cases, people wanted to keep their names. So for instance, I know I'm going on a little bit here, but one of the submissions that we received that actually changed our mind also was that we were wondering about the name Lakeside, because we had actually changed the boundaries so that riding no longer touched a lake. And we heard from people in the riding that said, well, we like your boundaries, they're fine. We don't care that we're not touching a lake anymore, we still want to be called Lakeside. So that's what we did.
Other questions?
Can I ask a question of my colleagues here?
I think there's one more question, and then
okay.
and I'd come back to you. That's okay?
Sure.
I'm a member of the former Manitoba riding, very historic. It's generated some premiers. I know that this redistribution has to take place. I understand that this riding now, that the new one that's been created, will probably have, if not the largest population of any riding in Manitoba, but certainly very close to that. Will there be attempts in the future? I know with rural depopulation, the population is going to decline. Could we look at a redistribution again for this riding and a splitting up of it again?
Well, I can't predict what will happen in the future, but I know that it is unfortunate that some communities seem to get changed every redistribution. So I know that the town of Souris, for instance, has been in 3 different ridings, I think, over the last 3 distributions. You know, that is an unfortunate event. One of the things about the mandate of the commission also is that, you know, we were stuck with the 57, and there wasn't really room for us to make recommendations to go beyond that, although we heard from a variety of individuals who argued in favor of increasing the number of ridings in the province, which in their view would mean that there would likely be less moving around with, you know, population changes wouldn't affect the ridings quite so much. So in the larger provinces, you don't see such dramatic change where every 10 years, you know, there has to be large and significant shifts. I would, however, say that the long-term picture would suggest that southwestern Manitoba isn't likely to increase its population as a proportion of the Manitoba whole. That doesn't seem to be one of the things that's going on. We did try to take into consideration what we already knew on the ground, by the way, and that is what had happened since the census of 2006. So we've talked about some of the ridings that are way out of whack. Fort White, which is a riding in the suburbs in Winnipeg in the south of the city, was over 45% larger than the electoral quotient, and obviously had to be changed. We also knew that it was probably even more than that, because since 2006, Waverly West community had been built in that area. We also knew that about Southdale. We knew that about some of the areas in North Kildonan. So we tried to keep those a little bit below the electoral quotient and allow areas where the demographers were pretty clear that there wasn't going to be a great deal of shift, and that since 2006 there hadn't been a lot of increased population. We allowed them to be a little bit over the electoral quotient, but really by no more than very small fractions. So my question for my colleagues here, their wonderful work reminds me actually of a much less wonderful project that I did when I was a student many years ago, back when Lake Agassiz was still in place. And so I was wondering if either, you know, these researchers or their sponsor would be interested in a similar kind of project that they're doing on the basis of their database and so on, and that is, once we've had the election in 2011, wouldn't it be interesting to look at those numbers using the 1998 boundaries, and then you could discover whether or not the electoral redistribution really changed the outcome of that election. You know what I mean? So what you've done is to overlap the 2007 outcome onto the new boundaries, but you could also, once the election has occurred, go backwards and try to determine whether the change in boundaries has had that kind of effect. In other words, if people voted in 2011 the same way as they would have in the new boundaries, but we still had the old boundaries into place, would that have made a difference? So, what do you think about that as a research project?
I think there are endless ways that we could go about doing that. We were talking about that on the way here, how you could go and look at the 1998, everything since the first time the NDP came in power. We could go back and look even before that and see if those boundary changes, if everyone voted the same that year as the boundary changes before the election before that, and just kind of compare and see. Because it's a lot of polling districts to draw, but it would probably be very interesting working now that we have experience at it.
Right.
And we'd be using the same
Yeah.
districts, would we not?
Right,
I think
yeah.
the majority of the work is done already. I think it's a very clever idea. Yeah.
So you need your sponsor to give you some money.
Any other questions or comments from those in the audience today? Do the panelists have any questions for each other?
Well, I've got a question for Richard, actually. If you could just speak a little bit about the name choices, because as you said before, in Lakeside, the problem wasn't so much with the boundary changes as it was with the names, and some of the things that the commission took into account when choosing to name, for example, Riding Mountain instead of Minnedosa Russell, or using hyphenated combinations like there were in federal elections.
Right, well, we had a couple of principles that I must say we just sort of discussed and came up with because the legislation is silent. And that is that, first off, we tried not to change names if the riding hadn't been changed dramatically. So the first assumption all the way was that as little change as possible was the best. But what we found was because of the shifts in population and because of what we had to do once we started making some changes meant that we made changes here and then there and then there and there and there, was that there were some significant changes that were taking place. So when we talked about new names, we did work with a couple of, I guess, preferences, and one was that we tried to get away from hyphens. In the past in Manitoba, there have been 2 hyphens, 3 names, that sort of thing. We didn't get away from it entirely. Morden Winkler made sense to us because literally we took Morden and Winkler and drew a boundary almost around them that took in those cities. But we tried to stay away from that. We also tried to stay away, as I mentioned, from privileging one town over the other. And we actually heard this in the public hearings, that why does Dauphin get its own riding? Why does we even heard it with Minnedosa. Why is Minnedosa getting its own name privileged? And we had actually suggested Russell Minnedosa for this riding, and there was some backlash against it. So instead, we went to the more generic names that that represented the area, the geography, perhaps something about the history of the place as well, that didn't involve names of individuals. And probably the clearest example of that was that we found it rather inappropriate, frankly, that one of the most highly Aboriginal areas of the province was named after essentially a colonial individual, perhaps with not the strongest record of supporting Aboriginal communities, and that was Rupert's Land. And so we actually involved the community in that riding in a discussion about what the name should be, and that's how we came up with the Kawatna riding, which means from the north. So we did have a good deal of discussion about the names. Again, Dawson's Trail is another one of them, and that came from that case also where we had originally split this historical area where the French-speaking communities were linked along Dawson's Trail, but we also didn't want to give one rural municipality its name because that also advantaged that one over the other. So in some areas we could do that, in other areas we couldn't. In the city it was sometimes a little bit more difficult. We had proposed the name Pembina Jubilee for one of the ridings that actually just goes around that intersection. I thought it was brilliant, but we heard from people and they didn't like it, and so it became Fort Garry Riverview, which actually is highly appropriate. So there was a lot of discussion. That was kind of one of the fun things, but we also found that people took those names really seriously, and so we did take into consideration their deeply felt views.
Well, I'll exercise moderator's prerogative and ask a question of the research group. And I wonder if you could point to something or maybe a series of things that you found most surprising from your research. Is there anything that really surprised you?
Well, what we as a group thought was most surprising was how little change there actually was. Because when we started the project, we actually expected at least 5, maybe more constituencies to actually switch from one party to another. And eventually we found that only 2 of them actually changed, and by a very, very close margin. So that was, for us, the most surprising thing, that almost nothing would change if everything else stayed the same and just the boundaries changed. Anything else?
No, that's exactly it. Yeah, I'm the one we divided up the boundaries, and I was the one doing what turned out to be the area with the only 2 boundaries that did change. I had Brandon West and River East, and we were very surprised. I think it's a testament, though, to the fact that it is nonpartisan. You can't get more nonpartisan than everything essentially stays the same, because depending on how we count the votes for partial voting areas that fall partly in one new boundary and partly in another, we still have to kind of add those votes up in a different way. But if you add some of those votes, there was 2 votes, I think it was, that separated the NDP from Conservative win in River East. That's so close that it obviously means that the boundary distribution does not radically change like we've seen in the past, the outcome, and it'll be, any major changes, like Brett said, will be based 99% then on if people have changed their voting preference.
Can I just jump in there on River East? The commission stayed away from any kind of work like these individuals did. We didn't want to know about how the votes went, but there were some ridings where we knew that there was a strong sense of that, because when we held 3 community meetings in Winnipeg and didn't divide it up in any way, but at all 3 of them there was somebody from River East arguing about there are these apartment units that we had moved from here to there, and these apartment units, they have a community of interest with the rest of this. At one meeting, at the next meeting, these apartment blocks, there's some older people in there, and they can't walk across to vote over there. Well, there would be polls in their apartment block, so we knew that there were people, making claims that were highly partisan, but we didn't take that into account, and we waited for people like this to do the work, and then afterwards we could find out how our work might have changed this riding or that riding.
And I'll just add one thing. What the research team has done is actually quite revolutionary, and it took a number of hours. We're talking hundreds of person-hours worth of work here, and I know that their information will be available through the MIPR website, mipr.ca, but it will also be available. I understand Google Maps stores those publicly, and I'm sure once all of the research is complete, the research team would be happy to share those results with folks. So I'd just like to say on behalf of the folks at U of M, we're very proud of you guys for doing a great job.
Absolutely.
Any other comments or questions from the audience? Questions, comments from the panel? All right, can you throw me my paper? Thank you. All right then. Well, thank you everyone for coming out tonight. Our next event in the Café Politique series will be held in Winnipeg at the Millennium Library on September 8th. We'll be exploring myths surrounding campaigning during an election period with Royce Coop of Queen's University, Robert Ermel of the Manitoba Institute for Policy Research, and Dan Lett of the Winnipeg Free Press. Now, I'd like to thank a whole series of people who helped to make tonight's event happen. I'd like to thank our presenters, the Manitoba Institute for Policy Research at the University of Manitoba, the University of Manitoba's President's Office, the Office of the Vice President Research, the Faculty of Arts, the Department of Political Studies, the University of Manitoba's Alumni Association, and more locally, Dorothy McLean of the Minnedosa Community Center, Bill and Jude Wesley for all of their fantastic organizational and recording support for tonight, Craig Ratz of the Westman Communications, and finally, all of the other volunteers who helped make tonight's event possible. Stay tuned to your local Westman channel for this event to be rebroadcast, and tell your friends and family and those you pass on the street that there's an interesting event that they can watch. Finally, watch our website, umanitoba.ca/U2011 for more information about Manitoba's politics and elections. We're also on YouTube, and you can friend us on Facebook, and you can also sign up to receive updates on this series. So thank you all for coming out tonight and for helping to make this event a successful one. Thank you so much.